how to start using the new iTunes podcast tags for iOS 11. Welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode 316. Thank you for joining me for the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, and this is the award-winning in-depth podcast about podcasting. It's where I give you the guts and teach you the tools to launch and improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. With the release of iOS 11, Apple supports new podcasting tags for your podcast RSS feed. So this episode will be about how you can start using these today so that when iOS 11 is released, your podcast can already be prepared and take advantage of these new tags. And it's totally okay to start using them now. Just don't expect them to show up if you're still running iOS 11 or older operating systems. But these new things will show up when iOS 11 is released, or maybe it's already been released by the time you're hearing this episode, and you want to know how to make your podcast appear better with these new tags. So first, what are the new and updated iTunes tags for podcasts? At WWDC 2017, Apple announced iOS 11, and they released new information about new tags being added to the iTunes podcasting spec, and that these new tags would be supported in the upcoming Apple Podcasts app on iOS 11. They didn't really talk about iTunes and whether these new tags would be supported on desktop iTunes, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's not much of a focus, because through the Apple ecosystem, iTunes desktop represents a very, very, very small portion of the overall podcast consumption. Apple represents maybe 60 to 70% of podcast consumption out there. And of that, iTunes could be as small as 5% for many podcasts. So this may not be supported in iTunes, although they didn't say one way or the other. But even if it's not that big of an issue, because the majority of your Apple listening audience will be listening through the Apple Podcast app on iOS, and they will see these new features. So the new tags are iTunes Type, iTunes EpisodeType, iTunes Title, iTunes Episode, iTunes Season, and they updated the iTunes Summary and Content Encoded tags, or at least their recommendations for these. So what each of these mean: first, the iTunes Type tag is a show or channel level tag. And it has two options, episodic or serial. Episodic would be for non-chronological episodes that will behave as podcast episodes have for years and download the latest episode. For most of us, we would want to leave our shows as episodic. That's the default. And that's if you don't specify anything for the iTunes type, it will assume episodic, and it will then behave as it has for years. So when someone subscribes to your podcast, they'll download the latest episode and then download new episodes after that. The other option is serial, and this is for chronological episodes that should be consumed oldest to newest, either for a specific season or for the entire show as it exists in the Apple Podcast app. This is good for when you have serialized content, and it's really important for someone to listen in a specific order, chronologically, because they're following a story. You don't want them to hear episode 5 if they didn't catch the premise of the story back in episode 1. So this is good for dramas, for multi-part training, anything like that, where it's really important that someone start at episode 1 of either the entire show or of the latest season. And when I talk about seasons, you may not want to use serial as your show type for a podcast about a TV show. Although a podcast about a TV show is based on seasons, it may not be necessary for people to go back and download episode 1 of the current season, because they may be current on the TV show right now and they've just found your podcast. So they don't need to go back and listen chronologically. They want to pick up with where they are now. But if it is important for them to listen to episode 1 and then episode 2 and then episode 3 in that kind of order, then you would want to choose the iTunes Type serial. Then there's the iTunes EpisodeType. That's an episode or item level tag. And the rest of these tags I'm going to tell you about are episode level tags, or technically item level as they appear in the RSS feed. So the iTunes EpisodeType is for specific episodes to set them to either full, trailer, or bonus. Someday in the future, Apple may release more show types as well as episode types, but this is what we're getting with iOS 11. Full is the same thing you're used to right now. So if you don't define anything, Apple Podcasts will assume it's a regular full episode. Trailer would be to promote an upcoming show, upcoming season, or upcoming episode. And my theory is that the trailer will come before whatever you've attached it to. So if you add an episode number to a trailer, it will come right before that episode number. Or if you add a season number but no episode number, then the trailer will come before that entire season. And if you add no season number or episode number, then I would assume the trailer would come before the entire show. Bonus is for extra content related to a show, a season, or an episode. And my theory is that that will be the opposite of a trailer. So where the trailer is before a show, a season, or an episode, I think that bonus will be after a show, a season, or an episode. Apple hasn't confirmed this yet, but that's my theory. So trailer comes before, bonus comes after. So if you set a bonus and attach it to an episode, then the bonus will appear after that episode, but before the next episode. Or if you set it to a season without an episode number, I think bonus would then show up at the end of that season before the next season. Or if you set it to your overall show, I don't know where it would appear. Maybe as the most recent thing, maybe somewhere along in the flow of things based on its publication date. A lot of this we don't know yet because we don't have enough data to really see how these things will work. But those are my theories on the trailer and bonus. You don't have to worry about setting those if you never change your episode type. Like for the Audacity to Podcast, nearly everything is a regular full episode. But for the recent Podcast Awards announcement, I could set that as a bonus episode and then remove that later on. And by the way, speaking of Podcast Awards, thank you very much for your support of the Audacity to Podcast, Beyond the To-Do List, and Once Upon a Time podcast in the Podcast Awards. The nominations are now closed, so now it's the time where we wait until International Podcast Day on September 30th to discover what podcasts won the People's Choice Podcast Awards. And you can follow along with their progress over at podcastawards.com and prepare for International Podcast Day on September 30th at internationalpodcastday.com. The next tag is iTunes title. This is, again, an episode or item level title. This should contain only the episode title. No episode number, no season number, not even your show title in it. Like I wouldn't put the Audacity to Podcast in here as the iTunes title. It needs to be only that individual episode's title. And this can be used with any kind of show type or episode type. The next tag is iTunes episode, and this would be any number to indicate the current episode number, which can be relative to the current season, like episode 5, or it can be relative to the entire show, like episode 316. So yes, you could have multiple episode 5s in your podcast when you have multiple seasons, but if you attach an episode to a season, it will be episode 5 of that season. So you don't have to keep this overall running number or try and do 105, 106, 205, 206, that kind of thing. You can simply set the episode number to 5 and then set the season number. And again, this can be used with any show and episode type. It doesn't have to be serial or it doesn't have to be episodic. It can be either way. The next tag is iTunes season at the episode or item level, and that's any number to indicate the season in which this episode belongs. And this can also be used with any show or episode type. You can have seasons if your show is simply episodic, like a TV show fan podcast. You can, of course, have seasons if your show is serial, like the podcast Serial, or like Fall of the House of Sunshine, or something like that, where it's a chronological show. Setting the iTunes season number then attaches that episode to that season regardless of the publication date. So even if you're in season 10 and you release a bonus episode for season 5, then that episode will appear back in season 5. It won't appear currently with season 10. How it's downloaded inside of a podcast app, if someone has already caught up on all 10 seasons, we don't know that yet. Next is the iTunes summary tag. This is a tag that's existed for a while, so it's merely updated and the recommendations have changed for how to use this tag. This is best for a short description of your episode. Think 1 or 2 sentences, and it will display above the full show notes inside of the podcast app. So this could be your little teaser that explains the episode title or the episode contents a little bit more. Try to avoid any front-loaded patterns. So don't say in this episode, that kind of thing. Just start with something interesting and make it descriptive of the episode's contents. And then there's the content encoded field. This isn't actually a podcasting spec. It's in the RSS spec. And this is at the episode or item level. This is designed to hold the entire contents of the post. So if you're using something like Feedly to subscribe to a blog and you can read the entire blog contents inside of Feedly, that content is coming from the content encoded tag. And again, Apple has supported this for a while, but they've updated their recommendations on this. So they now say no HTML in the iTunes summary tag, but HTML is acceptable in the content encoded tag. And already, if you let your full show notes display in content encoded, they will display in the podcast app on iOS, as well as in Overcast and other podcast apps that read the content encoded for the full show notes. So in iOS 11 with the new podcast app, the content encoded information, your full show notes, will display below the title and below the summary. So you might want to consider making your summary different from the first sentence of your full show notes. You could maybe consider having them the same because the full show notes don't display until someone taps on that episode to play it. But they'll still see both the summary and the full show notes. So that's why I recommend maybe making that first sentence of your full show notes be something different from your summary, but it's probably okay if they're the same. Go back and listen to episode 310 if you want some more information about these tags and all of Apple's other updates. That's where I talked about iOS 11, the podcast analytics, the podcasting spec update, and some other things that Apple announced at WWDC 2017 that will affect podcasters. Some great stuff like the new Podcast Connect that will show podcast analytics for consumption data so you can see how far people listen in an episode or where they skip in your episodes. A lot of cool stuff. I got really passionate when I was talking about it. So go back and listen to episode 310, or you can get that link in the show notes for this episode, number 316, at theaudacitypodcast.com/new-tags-17. So how can you take advantage of these new tags? Because you can start doing this today so that when iOS 11 is released, these new tags will be ready and your podcast will take advantage of the new style of displaying inside of Apple Podcasts if your podcast is the kind of show that would want to take advantage of these new things. You probably know that the 2 ways I recommend you generate your podcast RSS feed are either PowerPress on your own self-hosted WordPress website or Libsyn. You can host your media on Libsyn but generate your feed with PowerPress. And you can also use Blueberry to host with PowerPress, which I think is the best combination. But if you're running a website that can't create its own RSS feed or you don't want to create your RSS feed through your own website, then Libsyn is the other option that I highly recommend. Both PowerPress and Libsyn support these new iTunes tags. So if you're using WordPress with the PowerPress plugin to generate your RSS feed, then the following steps will help you to enable these new podcast tags for iTunes and start using them. And as you're working with PowerPress, if you're running the latest version, then you'll probably notice the little red new tags next to the new options inside of PowerPress. So to set it up in PowerPress, step 1, log into your WordPress admin dashboard. Step 2, if you haven't already updated to PowerPress 7.1 or later, then go to Dashboard and Updates and update PowerPress. And if you don't see the update for PowerPress there, but you know you're not running the latest version, which is 7.1 or later, then you may need to click on Check Again if the update isn't listed there. Step 3, go to PowerPress, then Settings, then the iTunes tab. Step 4, set the iTunes type to either episodic or serial, depending on your needs. Then, step 5, go to the Episodes tab. Step 6, checkmark the new tags you want to use for your individual episodes. Those could be the iTunes summary field. That's an old tag, but it's a new behavior and new recommendations with it. Also, the iTunes episode title field and iTunes episode number, season, and type fields. Then step 7, click Save Changes. this has now enabled the new fields for when you're creating your episodes or editing old episodes. So, step 8, create or edit a post. Step 9, scroll to the podcast episode widget. Step 10, if you're changing an already published episode, then check mark modify existing podcast episode, and then you'll see all of these new fields that you can change. Step 11, enter the appropriate information in the new iTunes episode and iTunes title fields. And step 12, enter a 1 or 2 sentence description in the iTunes summary field, or you can leave it blank, or maybe you never enabled it in the first place, and PowerPress will use your excerpt if you wrote an excerpt for this post, or it will use a truncated version of your full show notes. And then step 13, click update or publish when you're finished editing your post. Go to the show notes at theaudacitypodcast.com/newtags17 so you can review these notes and see where you need to make these changes. If you're using Libsyn to host your media and create your RSS feed for you, now many people use Libsyn to host their media, but don't use Libsyn to create their RSS feed. This is only if you're using Libsyn to do both for you. And your RSS feed, as it shows in Apple Podcasts, is a Libsyn-based RSS feed. Then here's what you do. Step 1, log into your Libsyn account and choose the right show. Step 2, click on Settings in the menu. Step 3, scroll down to iTunes Show Type and then choose between either episodic or serial. Step 4, click Save. Step 5, go to Content and either add new episode if you're wanting to publish a new episode, or go to previously published to find an already published episode you want to update. And you would do this then for all of the separate episodes that you want to update. Step 6, go to the Details tab inside of that episode post editor. Step 7, enter your full show notes in the description box near the top. Step 8, scroll to iTunes optimization and then enter the appropriate information in the new iTunes title, episode type, season number, and episode number fields. Step 9, enter a 1 or 2 sentence description in the iTunes summary field, or you can leave it blank to use a truncated version of your show notes in the description box at the top. And then step 10, click publish when you're finished editing your post. Whether you're using PowerPress or Libsyn and you've made these changes, then it will update that individual episode, and you may need to go back and update a bunch of episodes if it's important enough for your show. Now, if you have an episodic show, like the Audacity Podcast is an episodic show, then it's probably not necessary to go back and update all of that information unless you want to have the iTunes title be only your episode title and not your show name, your episode number, and that kind of stuff. If you have a seasonal show, then it's probably much more important to you to go back and update all of the previous episodes so that they're attached to the proper season and proper episode numbers, and all of that other information is set, whether it's chronological with a serial show type or if it's not chronological with an episodic show type. Don't expect to see these things show up immediately. Certainly, if you're not on iOS 11 yet, you probably won't see these things. But if you're on iOS 11, it may still take a couple days for your RSS feed to update in the podcast app so that it shows this new information as it's supposed to. It's even possible that it won't change if you've already downloaded all the past episodes. And I suspect that other podcast apps like Overcast, Pocket Casts, and such will soon add support for these new tags so that the experience on those apps will be very similar. PowerPress and Libsyn are my top recommendations for generating your podcast RSS feed. But if you're not using either of them for your podcast publishing system, then how you add support for these tags, enable them, or enter information in them will probably be a little bit different for each of these different podcast publishing platforms. However, you will probably see the new tags in 2 different places. First would be your show level settings. That's where the iTunes type would be, and you could then set it to either episodic or serial in your overall show level settings. And the rest of the settings would probably be in the episode publishing and updating interface. And that's where you would enter the information for the episode type, the iTunes title, the season number, the episode number, as well as the iTunes summary and the full show notes in your content. Some podcast publishing platforms may label these things slightly differently. but they'll probably eventually support them. Unfortunately, you can probably expect to not see these new features in FeedBurner's SmartCast, which at this point we should probably be calling Dumbcast. And you probably won't see these features in SoundCloud if SoundCloud even continues supporting podcasting from their platform, which I really think they won't. Because regardless of what you think about SoundCloud's future, most likely they will remove the podcasting feature because that seems like it's the most costly. They're the most behind on supporting technology with their podcasting feature. And SoundCloud is really known best for being a music platform. So even if they don't go out of business completely, although plenty of people think they will and think they will very soon, I really think they'll either remove the podcasting feature or leave it dormant, and you may never get support for these new tags that iTunes supports. Apple gave enough advanced notice of these and documentation for these new tags that if whatever you're using to create your RSS feed, your podcast publishing platform, doesn't support these new tags by the time iOS 11 is released in fall of 2017, then I recommend you switch. Switch to someone who does support these things, and Blueberry and Libsyn are the two best places to do that. You can host your media somewhere else and use PowerPress and get access to these new tags, but I really think that hosting your media with Blueberry when you're using PowerPress is the best combination because you can then do everything managing your podcast through your WordPress website. Or if you want to use Libsyn to create your RSS feed, then they provide support for these new tools already. So both Blueberry and Libsyn, and by extension of Blueberry, PowerPress as well, support these things. And if you want to switch to either Blueberry or Libsyn, then use my affiliate promo code Noodle, and you'll get a free month with either company. And you may even get free migration, especially if you're moving from SoundCloud. I didn't realize this until recently. Libsyn will waive their migration fee if you're coming from SoundCloud. They're that serious about wanting to help you own your platform and get off of SoundCloud that they waive the migration fee, at least currently. So move to something that supports these new tags if whatever you're using doesn't support them by the time iOS 11 is released. Because even while I'm recording this episode right now at the end of July, there's still plenty of time for these other tools to implement support for these new tags. So if they don't support them by the time iOS 11 is released, then they're probably not staying current enough on podcasting. And other platforms will start rolling out support for this. So if you're listening to this podcast episode in early August or very soon after I publish this episode, and whatever tool you're using doesn't support these new tags, that doesn't mean you have to panic and leave that tool, unless you're on SoundCloud, that is. But be patient, maybe ask their support team when support will be coming, and be nice to them. But if they say they don't intend to support it, or if they say it's going to be a delay and the support won't be out until after iOS 11 is out, then I think you should consider leaving. So at this time, I know Blueberry, PowerPress, and Libsyn support the new feeds. Maybe a couple other companies support them as well. And to review how you can take advantage of these new tags, and to get the link to that old episode where I explain these tags in much more detail, then go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/newtags17 to see the show notes for episode 316, or you can probably see them inside of your podcast app. I have three people I'd like to thank for their kind reviews of the Audacity to Podcast. David J. Harmon, also known as Graphicos Man, host of the Star Citizen Zone podcast, wrote, "Thanks for help on podcasting. It's a hard world out there to podcast." It is, and I'm glad to have helped you some. You can check out David's podcast, Star Citizen Zone, at starcitizenzone.com. And what he says about the podcast is, are you an artist or want to become one and all your life you were told different? Well, I will talk about what an artist is and what they are not, plus give you some steps to help you take that step into the grand world of what it is to open your mind and put it where others can see it. I'm a digital artist now. I used to use the brush back in the 80s, and then I went to the computer and loved it ever since. So you can check that out at starcitizenzone.site. And I have the link to that podcast in the show notes for this episode as well. Also, thanks to Steve from the Marshall Islands, sounds like a nice place to live, He wrote, I'm a new listener, but have been binge listening. Now pause there for a moment. You'll see that a lot with people who really like a podcast. They will binge listen and go back to older episodes. Steve continues, I've been wanting to find information on how to podcast. It seemed to be an endless search pulling pieces from several sources. This podcast and the website are exactly what I needed to get started and motivated to launch. So I'm really happy about that. And my guess is maybe when Steve wrote that review, he hadn't launched his podcast yet. So that's why he couldn't mention it. And I can't link to it yet. But Steve, please comment on the show notes at theaudacitytopodcast.com/newtag17 with your podcast so I can link to it here and others can see the new podcast that you've been motivated to launch. And lastly, Gail L. Nobles wrote, I love how you explain about niches, profit, and the voice of podcasting. You cover so many things. Thanks for sharing your great knowledge. Thanks for building our confidence and sharing your ideas and opinions. Audacity is great. Thanks for sharing the meaning of the word. That is really encouraging. I love hearing how the Audacity to Podcast has helped you specifically. Like if you've had a success, if you've had a mind change on something, if you've been inspired, if you've been motivated, if you've gotten the answer you needed to overcome some struggle that you've been facing. So if that describes you and the Audacity to Podcast has helped you, would you consider writing a review for the Audacity to Podcast and make sure that you mention the name of your podcast so I can link to it and give it a little shout out in an episode of the Audacity to Podcast. And you can get those links and more information about that at theaudacitytopodcast.com/newtags2017. I hope to see you at Podcast Movement, and if you can, come to one of my 2 sessions. I'm leading a solo session about how you can get and use more podcast reviews, and we're kind of doing a Podcasters Roundtable as a session with Dave Jackson from School of Podcasting, Ray Ortega from the Podcasters Studio, and Addie Sacido from the Podcast Planner to talk about what's in a podcast RSS feed. So we'll be talking about these RSS tags and others. So if you're really geeky about RSS, then you'll love that session. And even if you can't make it to one of those sessions, I'd still love to see you at Podcast Movement. So stop by the Podcasters Society booth and shake my hand and be part of an upcoming episode of the Audacity to Podcast and tell me what inspired you to start your podcast. If you haven't registered yet, go to podcastmovement.com and use the promo code NOODLE to save 10%, and I hope to see you there. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for listening. The Audacity to Podcast is a proud member of Noodle Mix.